I have the distinct pleasure of reintroducing Jen Butler this morning, and fortunately, the vast majority of you were able to be here and interact with Jen yesterday. And from that experience, you know that her insight, her experience, her wisdom, and her vision for the transformative power of our faith far, far, far exceeds anything that could be captured in a bio. I also want to start by thanking Sarah Bellamy for her presentation, which I found profoundly moving and insightful. And I'm actually delighted that Sarah and Jen have been paired for our concluding time together, because I actually see a fundamental similarity. Sarah highlighted for us the power of theater as public witness. And I believe Jen represents the other side of that coin, public witness as theater. And normally I would be hesitant to use that phrase, public witness as theater, because I would fear that it might serve to trivialize that sort of work as superficial show. But in this context, I think we understand in a new and a deep way the seriousness of theater. It requires rigor, deep thoughtfulness, an understanding of our history and our current social context, and requires well-trained, well-prepared, and well-coached participants. For those of you who were here yesterday for the panel and were subjected to my little typology, you would think that on the face of it, Sarah and Penumbra Theater represents a powerful example of encounter, and Jen's work at Faith and Public Life as a clarion example of proclamation. And on the grid that I have passed out, those are at two ends of the sort of continuum. And this today helps show that in reality, it is not a grid, but a circle where encounter touches proclamation. And at that intersection of encounter and proclamation, we experience both personal transformation and an encounter with the prophetic imagination. I'm delighted to welcome Jen, Director of the Theater of Public Witness.
I feel like I just got a promotion. Wow, that was a great introduction. In fact, Steve almost took away my opening remarks because, thanks a lot, but you did it in such a more articulate way than I was going to do it. But I think I will just continue to hit on some of that. Amazing. And you guys have been amazing too. It's just been so great to be here the past couple of days and energizing for me with your questions and insights. Yeah, a couple of themes that I've been picking up on. Notice what Sarah said, that in addressing apathy, the way to go at it and to change people's hearts and minds is not through argument, which is exactly what we were talking about on the panel yesterday, but through empathy. Through empathy, which theater and faith and storytelling can do. And then we've been talking, through yesterday, especially in the panel, and then in terms of what Sarah's been talking about in terms of theater, about how so often as we think about what worship is and what church is, we tend in our human limited brains to sort of fragment those things into their various pieces. There's the worship that we do in the building, and we sing hymns, and we stand up, and we sit down. We do that, and then we have our church programs. And then we have our mission. I was really struck with what Eliezer was saying yesterday. We have our mission, and the mission is out there, as opposed to worship, which in the Hebrew means to serve. Worship being eliciting from the congregation and working with the congregation to engage them in service. Service not just to God, but service to God is service to the people, and it's all part of one piece. And then I'm so struck, as Steve was saying, by what Sarah was talking about in terms of theater and how much that integrates into the work we're doing with media. It's not just media strategy and trying to book as many people as we can on TV or get them in the newspaper. It's about telling a story It's about bringing our theology and bringing a life of meaning to people who are starving for moral guidance in a world that's fragmenting and falling apart. So if there's one thing you take away today because you feel, that your congregation's not ready for media or organizing or whatever it is, but if there's one thing you take away today, I hope that it's people are truly hungry for a specific Christian voice or Jewish voice or Muslim voice, but they're hungry to understand their tradition in such a way that it really applies to life and to the problems around them. Now that may sound so obvious, just so simplistic to say, but I do think, along the past few decades, because of what the Christian right has done, because of secularization, because of many things, we've convinced ourselves that perhaps people don't care to hear this voice anymore. Perhaps I need to take a back row seat. Perhaps I need to be a little quieter and humbler. But I think to do so is to abdicate our responsibility in the world today, to lead people and to be the change we wish to see. I was just talking to Charles about Occupy Wall Street and about why clergy don't wear stoles sometimes when they go out to protest or to join something like Occupy. And I could see two reasons for that, two reasons that I've heard in the course of my work. One is fear, and we've already talked about that, but the other is that they're embarrassed and they realize how the stoles might come across to people who have experienced the abusiveness of religion. And having talked to some who've worked at Occupy Wall Street, I can testify to that, having worked closely with folks who are really engaging the occupiers. They say they have had to go very carefully at bringing themselves to that protest because of the pain that's there. But what I want to encourage us to do is bring the faith dimension because people want it. So I want to tell a few stories of where this has worked and worked well. And these are stories of average people in organizations, even organizations that are barely making it, that have brought that story to the public square. So it's doable. And the first is this whole tussling that we've had with Congressman Paul Ryan throughout the past year, which has been absolutely fun. You are doing the Lord's work when you are in such joy and fun as we've had tackling Paul Ryan. And if you're not in joy, then there's something perhaps amiss. So this all started back when, it was actually Jim Wallace, I think, who first noted that Paul Ryan, although a devout Catholic who uses his Catholicism a lot to speak about his political objectives, so he's making this conversation fair game. He's opened up the conversation about what it means to be a Catholic public leader. And Jim Wallace first pointed out that he has all of his staff read Ayn Rand, the political philosopher who advocates for greed, the queen of greed, I like to call her. So Jim Wallace pointed out this irony, but it was sort of just flying beneath the radar of the press. And our staff were brainstorming about what we could do about this great irony. And as always happens in these brainstorms, we had, a little fear and trepidation. For one thing, do people even know who Ayn Rand is, For another thing, if we bring a religious conversation, a moral conversation to this, are people going to appreciate that, or are they going to find it in some way offensive? So what we decided to attempt was, we knew Paul Ryan was speaking at an annual Christian Right Conference that happens every year in Washington, D.C. In fact, I think it's called the Values Voter Conference. And we have a couple of folks in our midst who are great guerrilla tacticians, which I think is very important if you want to try some public theater, to have some bold spirits. It's not always I like to be nice, but I appreciate those people who can really get in there and work it. So we had a Catholic activist named James. Well, first they had to go into the forum, the Values Voter Conference, and figure out how they were going to ambush Paul Ryan. That was a whole staging thing. They did it brilliantly. So James is caught on video with one of my staffers who's dogging him, approaching Paul Ryan and saying, Sir, I'd like to talk to you. I'm a Catholic. You're a Catholic too, right? Oh, yes, I'm a Catholic. Well, I'd like to give you this Bible. I hear that you have your staff read Ayn Rand. I'd like to just ask if you'd be willing to hand this Bible to your staff and tell them to read Luke chapter 4, the subject of our opening worship, the scripture we chose. And Paul Ryan, of course, is, trying to escape the Catholic activist. And we caught the whole thing on video, and it was just perfectly filmed. And of course, again, as good progressive Christians, we were sitting around thinking, well, are people going to like this? I mean, we're giving a Bible to a congressman, like separation of church-state, all that stuff. I was like, no, let's go with it. We put it online. Every single top progressive blog in the country put that clip on their website. Daily Kos, TPM, Think Progress, got something like 50,000 views. But more than that, it sparked a national conversation because that week in USA Today, Stephen Prothero wrote a piece called Ayn Rand versus Jesus. It was Stephen Prothero, who is a well-known writer, thinker, wrote a piece in USA Today called Ayn Rand versus Jesus, and had both, like a little icon of both of their faces. And USA Today, which is the newspaper in the country that gets the most circulation. It's in every hotel, it's at your doorstep. And that meme continued to pick up. People continued to go through that discussion. Ayn Rand versus Jesus. What is the driving philosophy that drives our economic policy in this country? So I love the fact that we had all this angst. I mean, literally our staff was divided over whether we should do this or not. But what worked about it was not that of course, we're not trying to impose Christianity on our government or on our members of Congress. We're trying to provoke a conversation that points out the hypocrisy in our politics today and in some of our religion. And that's what people appreciated about it. So then going into the rest of the year, we caught Paul Ryan again, poor guy. But he did start the conversation, right? So we're just continuing the dialogue with him. We caught him on video saying that he had never said that he had endorsed Ayn Rand. He was starting to backpedal off of this because it was really dogging him. And then we caught him on video saying that his budget reflected Catholic social teaching. His budget is in line with what the bishops have said. So we wrote a blog post about that, pointing out just in how many ways, how do I love you? Let me count the ways that it disagrees with Catholic social teaching. And we knew the bishops were going to be a little reticent to speak out about this and to reinforce their teaching because they were distracted with other issues at the moment, like contraception. So we encouraged reporters, we sent the blog post around to all the top reporters that cover this issue and these kinds of issues, and we suggested that they call the bishops for comment to respond to what Paul Ryan had said, and of course they did. And so that became a national news story, and we blew the story up with another blog post saying the bishops versus Paul Ryan. So suddenly it became another big conflict. The bishops were a little understated in how they responded to the reporters. And we made sure it was clear, there's a contrast going on here. And so what we had started to do right there is similar to what Sarah's talking about in terms of theater. We're creating a morality play that has lasted for the past 2.5 years. It's an ongoing morality play with good guys and bad guys, in spirited, sometimes comical dialogue to make people think. So the next step in that was not too much later, maybe a few weeks later, Paul Ryan was slated to speak at Georgetown University. And we have a lot of friends at Georgetown. We have a big network of Catholic intellectuals who are constantly wanting to have some debate about defending their tradition, which has been co-opted by other forces. So we knew that Paul Ryan was coming to speak, and Father Tom Reese at Georgetown University took the lead on working with us to craft a letter that was quite civil in its tone. It said, "We welcome you, Paul Ryan. We're glad you're here, and we want to have a pointed conversation with you about what you've said about the budget and about how your budget will impact the poor." So they took him to task in this letter signed by 100 theologians. We got it to the press, and it was picked up in a number of outlets, but the most fun of which was it was on the Colbert Show. All right. So I'm going to attempt to have you guys listen to this Colbert Show piece. You're not going to be able to see it, but if you think about it, you know Colbert's face. And then there's Father Tom Rees. He's a very pleasant-looking man. So you're not going to be able to see it, but you're going to be able to, I think, hear the dialogue. And I want you to hear it and think about it from several different angles. One, everything I just mentioned in terms of our strategy work behind the scenes is featured in this piece. Colbert, the actor, acting like a conservative pundit, mentions almost every little piece of narrative that we drove over that past year before this broadcast was put together, before this show was put together. So note that, and then think about like what it is like, what do you call this? How does it fit? To me, it's worship. To me, it's theological teaching, and here it is on comedy and on primetime television. So again, we often think of like, oh, there's worship where we integrate theater, or where there's media where we integrate theology, but in a sense, it's all of one piece. It's a circle that all comes together. And then watch, so Colbert does a little preamble that's just brilliant, but then he brings on Father Tom Rees. And watch the way Father Tom Rees handles the interview. Note some of the tricky spots, because I'll ask you to tell me. And note how he handles it and stays on his positive message and doesn't sort of digress from that, because interviews can be tricky. So this gets to the media training piece of it. There is one piece that the visual would help. When Colbert says the word urban legend, picture Congressman Paul Ryan photoshopped to look like Bigfoot. And then you'll laugh even louder. Like Bigfoot, Sasquatch. So hopefully this will work. It may stutter some.
Before the break, we were discussing the brave fiscal ministry of Congressman Paul Ryan, who says his deep budget cuts to programs for the poor are in concordance with Catholic doctrine. Now, in response, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops replied, and I hope I'm pronouncing my Latin correctly, bullshit. Plus, the Jesuits in the Georgetown Mafia sent Ryan a nasty letter saying, your budget appears to reflect the values of your favorite philosopher, Ayn Rand, rather than the gospel of Jesus Christ. Rand, of course, believed that the only rational behavior is to pursue your own selfish interest, a belief shared by Rand admirers like Ron Paul, Clarence Thomas, and Scrooge McDuck. Ryan has defended himself, saying his reputation as an Ayn Rand follower was simply an urban legend. Exactly. Him admiring Rand is like Bigfoot. If Bigfoot had spoken at a celebration of Ayn Rand's 100th birthday and said this.
I grew up reading Ayn Rand, and it taught me quite a bit about who I am and what my value systems are and what my beliefs are. It inspired me so much that it's required reading in my office for all my interns and my staff. The reason I got involved in public service, by and large, if I had to credit one thinker, one person, it would be Ayn Rand.
Now, folks, I know you think you heard that, but it was just an urban legend. It was probably swamp gas reflecting off a weather balloon, and Venus was right. It's in the X-Files. The truth is out there. And the priest who wrote that nasty letter to Ryan has a lot to answer for. Here to answer for it, please welcome from Georgetown University, Father Thomas Rees. Father Rees, thank you so much for coming. Now, Father Rees, I don't get your problem or the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops' problem with Ryan's budget. Jesus said Whatsoever you do for the least of my brothers, that you do unto me. And all Ryan is suggesting is that we do the least we can. It's paraphrasing, but it's basic idea.
I think that's the problem. I mean, Jesus also said that we would be judged by whether we fed the hungry, gave drink to the thirsty, clothed the naked. And this budget doesn't do it. We believe that a budget is a moral document. It represents the values of a country, of a nation. And the values in this budget are that we would rather cut taxes for the rich than help the poor. And that's just simply unacceptable.
Okay, now, Jesus did say that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. But he said nothing about job creators. And that's what Ryan's talking about here. Ryan is talking about keeping the money with the wealthiest Americans so that they can create jobs. It's called trickle-down economics, all right? So you guys in the church, you trickle down all the time. You trickle that holy water on us. You're allowed to do it, and Ryan's not. What do you not understand trickle down?
I think that in the gospel, it's very clear that Jesus reached out and helped the poor, helped the sick. And this is what he calls us to do as his disciples. I mean, we're to show one another that we love one another and follow Christ in caring for the sick, caring for the poor, caring and giving people a hand up so that they can do these things.
He said, love thy neighbor, okay? But I got some pretty well-off neighbors. So if I let them keep their tax cuts, aren't I loving my neighbor? Does my neighbor have to be the poor guy? Why can't my neighbor be the rich guy?
Well, I think
Did I nail you? Are you nailed right
now?
now?
No. The way we love our neighbor who are rich is we encourage them to be good Christians and help those who are in need and pay their taxes. Jesus did say to pay your taxes and to help people in that way.
I don't remember that part. But what you're talking about is redistribution of wealth. That's socialism.
Shocking, isn't it?
That's socialism, okay?
And that's
Jesus did not room with Karl Marx, okay? Last time I checked, sir.
The last time I checked, however, though, Pope Benedict, who is not known as a liberal, actually says that one of the purposes of government is to redistribute wealth, to help poor people so that they can have a chance, that we should not concentrate all the wealth of the world in the hands of a very few people.
But if we did keep the wealth in the hands of the wealthiest people, wouldn't that be good for the kids who want to go to Georgetown? Because it costs like $800,000 a year to go there now, doesn't it? That's a little hypocritical, isn't it, Padre?
This is why we're also very upset about the cuts in Pell Grants.
Hey, I teach Sunday school. Sir, I teach Sunday school. Jesus didn't say anything about Pell Grants. Well, Father, thank you so much for joining me. Father Tom Reese, Georgetown University. We'll be right back.
Wow. Yeah, you can Google Father Tom Reese Colbert. It's on the Colbert website. And it's been there for a year, so I don't think it's going away. You know, it gets a lot of views. Oops, sorry.
Rand, of course, believe that the only rational behavior is to pursue your own...
Silence. Sorry. Control these devices. Yeah, so Father Tom Reese, R-E-E-S-E, in Colbert. Yeah, that's a great thing to show in a worship, if your congregation is ready for it. And you've done the prep work, or an adult forum, you know, to spark conversation. I sat there watching this. I never cease to laugh about it, but I always think, I wish growing up as a kid in Atlanta, I could have seen something like this. I would have learned more from this one interview than I learned in church growing up. You know? And this is what I mean when I say, you know, Colbert Show, CNN, the opinion page, these are our pulpits today. And the depth of the theological conversation that's being had there, the quoting of scripture back and forth, and yet totally in a playful, creative, and illuminating sort of way. What did you guys observe in this, just to hear a few responses? And in particular, did you notice some moments where Father Tom Reese could have really gotten caught up, or where you sort of held your breath, like, what's he going to say, you know? Like, and yet, how did he handle those situations in such a way as to communicate love, compassion, justice?
Well, you mentioned the triangle yesterday about staying on message, and that first, the first time he got a chance to speak, he hit his message right away, and then whenever something would come up where he could have gone off task, he just redirected it to again hit home that same message. So he said the same thing in 3 or 4 different ways, but he kept it the same.
You're on to his secret. So Tom Reese has been through that media training, the exact one I mentioned. And it's, I think it's a fairly unique approach. A lot of people will talk about talking points and different things, but having that core message in your triangle, what is the one theme you're trying to get across? And then having a few scriptures or stories, personal stories around that are going to help you illuminate it, so you can say that theme just in different ways and just stay with it.
There are 2 things that you just said that really resonated with me. One, Paul Ryan picked up Ayn Rand when he was a young person, and it became a powerful influence on him. And you just said how much you would have appreciated a richer view of the world as a person growing up in Atlanta.
Yep.
Which tells me that when we don't pay attention to our 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds in terms of their intellectual development and their spiritual development, we are missing a whole lifelong impression
Yep.
that will guide their decision-making, their relationships, and how they view the world.
That's right.
This
What?
is very important.
What if Paul Ryan had had Father Tom Reese for a professor?
Having a variety of views and varied experiences in the world to test their beliefs or their values,
Yeah.
and then having some place to debrief on that and to reflect on it is extremely meaningful. And I used to teach 9th grade, and people would say, how can you stand these 14-year-old girls all day? And I said, it's fascinating what they think they know, what they are beginning to believe, and where they might go in the world.
Yeah.
I think we don't pay enough attention to that developmental phase in terms of faith and also public action.
Yeah, yeah, and that's exactly where they're at. I'm privileging this side of the room. Do you notice? Because we kept hitting this side. So I'm going to take one more from here, and then I'll turn. Tracy? Okay, all right. No, well, I did it because yesterday I think y'all got neglected over here, right? You got neglected a little bit. I started that, yeah.
The gift of, when Ryan asked Petals and says, oh, no, I don't know. And the gift of having the direct quotes, his voice, his face. And I think that too often the church community is too polite and kind to lift up liars for being liars. And that's a huge calling of ours that we are missing. Then we need to put the evidence out there and say, well, that's a lie. Not the people liar about it.
Yeah,
We need to tell the real truth.
yeah, yeah, name it.
I think Colbert, too, as a satirist, has been very forthcoming about his own faith.
Yes.
You know, I mean, it's not the first time I've heard him say, I teach Sunday school. He does. I mean, he's a man who values faith. And so this has both the skill of an actor, of a satirist, but also a deep investment in his faith as a Catholic man not being misconstrued.
Yes.
You know,
Isn't that cool?
powerful witness.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then the way that he was able to say that we see it as a moral document, and then introduce those morality points that need to be considered in the document. So he took, it wasn't just an argument pro con on the document, but he moved it into a different sphere, and kind of to what you're saying, was able to articulate a progressive Christian view.
Yeah.
And talk
Yeah.
But, so rather than get tricked into a debate, he was able to kind of clearly articulate and shine on a moral vision.
Yeah, the place where he,
People see things differently than just kind of looking at keeping the conversation moving.
totally, and the place where he really could have gotten tricked into a sort of downhill debate was isn't this just socialism? And a lot of us might have been tempted to be like, well, what do you mean by socialism? And it's not so bad, and there's some good things about socialism. But instead, he stayed on his message, which was really interpreting Catholicism and what it actually says. So he quoted who? Do you remember? Benedict, Pope Benedict. Go to the top and quote him, because that man said some radical things about the economy.
And the other thing that was interesting is rather than, he probably has a vision that's completely over here compared to where the starting point was, but rather than just kind of say, well, I'm over here and people need to be over here, he did it kind of point by point and kept it connected to where the starting point was. So he didn't go too far away.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Good. Awesome analysis. All right, so moving on with our wrestle match with Paul Ryan. There's more scenes to this morality play throughout the year. So I think there were a couple of tussles somewhere in there, but the next big tussle was a really complicated situation that we had to work to figure out. In fact, I think this is one that has most tested the creativity of my staff and advisors. And it was this. The Pope, somewhere I think about April last year, issued a missive that criticized the nuns for too much work on social justice and not enough work on pro-life issues. This, of course, was devastating to the sisters who have worked for years in the trenches taking care of people's needs. And very scary because it's a hierarchical church. And unlike, of course, Protestant churches, there's not like sort of a forum or a hearing, like what is pronounced is pronounced. And that's the end of the story. And so it was a scary moment for all of us because the sisters have done such great work over the years and been wonderful spokespeople on behalf of the issues that we care about. If I had time today, I would tell the story of healthcare reform and how the nuns and Catholic Health Association saved healthcare reform. They made it happen by being bold and by speaking out. We provided a lot of media support to make sure that their voices got heard in that debate so that they could make the political difference. And because of that, that was one of the big reasons they were being censured by the Pope for stepping out when the Catholic Church opposed healthcare reform and the nuns and the Catholic Health Association supported it. So that was their punishment. And so what are you going to do? Hierarchical church, you can't exactly, issue a response or a sort of direct rebuttal. Besides which, the sisters really want to stay focused on their mission, which is to help the poor, take care of the communities that they've always been taking care of. And the Ryan budget is continuing to dominate public debates, and they want to continue to take him on. And so that's what they decided to do. Now, at the same time, we had another element going on, and that was that the bishops had been attacking healthcare reform and healthcare implementation because they felt like it was going to force Catholic institutions to pay for contraception. So there's the whole contraception debate going on. And they had declared a fortnight for religious freedom to end on July 4th, go over the July 4th weekend. And we were trying to think of like, well, what do you do about that? How do you sort of provoke a different conversation there? And felt sort of stymied, like how are we going to do this? And prevent the bishops from getting so much press around this idea that barring contraception is somehow representing American freedom. So what we did was planned nuns on the bus for during the fortnight for religious freedom. Great timing because it made the story all the more interesting. And we measured our media hits that we got for nuns on the bus, and we totally wiped Fortnight for Religious Freedom off the map. Totally drowned it out. So some of you may not have heard of Nuns on the Bus. How many of you did? I'm just curious. Yeah, it's one of the media campaigns that we've done that, I will be sitting at church and the Tea Party member goes, and that Nuns on the Bus, it doesn't realize we've been working on it. I'm like, oh, well, interesting conversation to be had there. It seems to have gotten out everywhere. And I have to say, too, like the nuns were incredibly brave on this. Sister Simone Campbell decided not to take this lying down. Now, they've been through tough times, tough financial times in this economic environment. They've been struggling, and then they get this reprimand. Sister Simone Campbell went to the progressive community and said, help, what can we do together? And so we teamed up and designed this tour. They went across the Midwestern states, heavily Catholic states, politically important states, and they stayed on their message of protecting the poor. They lifted up stories of poor families, families not getting health care coverage, families struggling with loss of jobs, unemployment benefits, and lifted those voices up across the country and everywhere they went. And now I'd say Sister Simone Campbell is about as big a spokesperson as Jim Wallace, continues to get tons of media coverage, and has now been identified by the press as a go-to voice on budget debates. And I can tell you, it's hard to establish a religious voice as an expert on economic policy. Often the media doesn't see that. So we've continued that debate and conversation, and going forward, the nuns have also worked historically, of course, for protecting the rights of immigrants. So their next tour is Nuns on the Border. So they'll be starting at Ellis Island and going through the South and through the West all the way to California. And we'll be meeting with members of Congress along the way. We'll be doing lots of media and trying to build around Sister Simone a big constituency base that she can continue to mobilize in the future. And speaking of that too, in terms of our media work, you can't do good media work unless there's really good organizing happening. And the media work should always complement the organizing work. And the media work should always be rooted in the deep theological thinking that's being done here at the seminary. As you saw in the Tom Reese interview, it should never become trite and superficial. It should always be deep and push the conversation, as Eleazar was saying yesterday. I want to mention a couple of other examples. So that is our Catholic work. Let me check in on my time. There's an interview with Simone Campbell. Do you guys want it? It's very short. Yeah, you want to see it? Can't resist. It's just so great to see these examples. To me, like I sometimes cry when I watch these. Like, this is the way it should be, right? These voices should be everywhere, including, there's some Jewish groups that are doing some great work similar to ours. We work interfaith, but there's a group called Bend the Ark that's really starting to get Jewish voices out there, and we just did some work with them in North Carolina over these pink licenses that they were going to make immigrants carry, with a pink stripe on them, reminiscent of the Holocaust and the things that went on. And so the Jewish community in North Carolina spoke up against this, did some great work, and then we did a sort of national Jewish push that got a lot of press attention as well. And Bend the Ark took the lead on that, and we supported them in that effort. We'll see if this will come up right. This slide sometimes has been getting a little glitchy. See if I can. So this is Simone Campbell's first appearance on the Colbert Show. She says some really profound things in this and just quick sound bites that amaze me. She is incredible because, one, she's a lawyer, so she's a great debater, but she's a community organizer, community educator, and so she's engaged people for years at the level of compassion and empathy and creative education, and you see this in the way she does her interviews.
Actually, what I'll admit is that we're faithful to the gospel. We work every day to live as Jesus.
See if I can rewind this a little bit. Sorry, I don't know why this slide is starting to start in the middle of the interview. All right, we'll do our best here. So this is Colbert with Sister Simone Campbell.
Jesus did in relationship with people at the margins of our society. That's all we do.
That's a cheap applause line. Jesus. You can throw Jesus into anything and people are going to applaud. Well, you've got a bus tour coming up, starting this Thursday, okay? You guys, you and some other nuns, I'm guessing? Bunch of nuns are getting on a bus?
Right.
That's a movie right there. Okay, nuns on a bus. And you guys are going to go to nine different states?
9 states.
To different places where nuns are doing
Great work, and we're going to lift up their work, but we're also stopping at Congress offices, congressional offices, especially of Congress people who voted for the House budget proposed by Congressman Ryan. And that budget undermines the whole fabric of our society. And people don't know it. We want to educate people about what's going on in Congress and make sure that they push back against hijacking our nation.
Well, now, do you realize...
It's the least we can do for people who are suffering in this economy, that are left out, that are pushed to the margins.
But if we're just concentrating on the poor, helping the poor, that leaves the rich out. Guys like me...
That's what the rich should be doing.
No, listen, we need more help. The poor shall inherit the kingdom, right, of heaven. A camel can get through the eye of a needle more than a rich man can get into heaven. I need help more than a poor person does.
You need help to respond, to be generous, because, you know, there's enough to go around if we would only share. It's this American ideal that we should just hoard and hold on to the individual things that we have.
Jesus himself said, I got mine, Jack.
Jesus broke the bread and gave it to everybody and said, eat and be filled. And there was enough if you share.
Well, I'm not going to debate the gospel with a nun. That's not fair. Sister, thank you so much for joining me. The head of Network, a National Catholic Social Justice Lobby.
I'm going to show you her picture. Maybe some of you guys have seen her. She's so great on camera. She just has this wonderful, winsome smile, and has that sort of prophetic quality that, like, the best sister you've ever met would have, but also that compassionate quality. So even when she's, you know, saying something that's pretty convicting, she's got this compassionate feel to her as well. You know, sort of that chiding, like, well, you need help being generous, you know? Which is wonderful, you know, because again, people are looking to us to sort of pull them to the high road, and we don't want to ever sort of get down in the mudslinging sort of, you know, bitter debating. It's like, you know, we believe in everybody, and we're going to call them all to their better angels. Anything you guys noticed in terms of the quality of the interview and what was done there and how she interacted?
I really liked how she's like getting to that issue of we really need to rethink our whole system, our whole economic. I mean, she's not using any words there.
That's pretty deep for like primetime TV comedy, right? Like, and just like, how many words was that? 8 words? Like, that was some deep stuff. That's the stuff we're talking about here, you know? It wasn't trite one bit, but it was short and quick and to the point, and she had prepared for that. So it can be done. I'm going to close with some suggestions of what we could do in our seminaries, just a sort of imagination exercise, and you guys might want to add to that in the Q&A and discussion time, because we'll have a bit of time for that. So imagine, what if seminaries were actively engaged from cradle to grave in training and then supporting their students with the tools and infrastructure they needed as they went into public ministry, whether that were advocacy, the media, or church development? What if we trained clergy in public leadership, both in terms of how you speak to the media as well as how you organize for change, which is what, frankly, is being done here, which is what's so great. Community organizing strategies would also be incredibly useful for those who are trying to grow or transform congregations or start new ones. I was talking to Paul on the panel yesterday, and he was talking about the Isaiah training, which again, you can get funding to do. No matter what you're doing, even if it's not organizing, even if it's trying to change an organization or trying to bring a church to a new point in its development, the community organizing training is critical. It will do more for you in that 1 week. I did an MSW in community organizing. I wish I had just taken 1 week of an Isaiah community organizing training. So I highly recommend it. He said, one of the things they do is teach you to be comfortable with tension. I used to flee from tension. Like, my family was passive aggressive. I did not want any tension, but to be comfortable and to engage the tension and to address it by asking questions and finding out where people are coming from and hearing what their fears are and starting the conversation there, that's invaluable for anything you do. We would have classes that would be like this. Progressive Church Startups 101. Pastor as community organizer, building churches, building just societies. Media and the modern pulpit. Developing your voice. And in this class, we would have to say Jesus 20 times without blushing or getting tongue-tied. What if we developed a cohort of social entrepreneurs to help rebuild a progressive religious movement? People who would start new organizations, new progressive churches, and fill the ranks of our staff and community organizing networks. And what if we could fund them as they left seminaries with entrepreneurial funds to support their startups? So many of us, if we're going out into congregational work, my husband and I have experienced this, you end up in a congregation whose call is not your call. Whereas if you're starting a congregation with who you are and your sense of call and what God is leading you to do, you're bringing people around you whom you can really lead and whom you can participate in the kingdom of God with great joy, instead of feeling hampered and confined and like your gifts are not being used. If there's no joy in it, then God's not there, right? It's not drudgery ministry. It should be joyful, even as it's hard at times. What if we could sponsor dialogue to help heal the religious-secular divide in this country, which is part of why progressive faith has not been a part of progressive activism in politics? And what if we figured out more ways to popularize our beautiful, beautiful theology? What if we turned out students who published books that sold as well as Rick Warren's? What if we helped our students start radio shows or top blogs? Wow. Those are some of my ideas, and I'm sure you guys have ideas from this week, so I'd love to hear them or take any questions that you might have.